How's it going, guys? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today I'm going to show you how I approach using reverbs on snare drums. A couple weeks ago, I posted a video about how I mix snare drums, and in that video, I talked about how to use EQ, compression, saturation, gating, samples, etc. on snare drum. So if you want to learn all about that stuff, I'll put a link to that video up here in the corner, as well as down in the description. But that video was starting to get a little bit long, so I decided to leave the reverbs out of that and make that into its own video. So if you haven't seen that video yet, let me just play our mixed snare drum so you can see what we're working with. And in the context of the full drum mix, cool. So let's check out our reverbs. So on both my snare top and my snare sample track, I am sending to two different sends, the snare plate and snare smash, and those are my two different reverbs. Most of the time I will also send the snare bottom there as well, but I guess it just wasn't working on this track, so for whatever reason I didn't send that. But I'm just sending these at equal levels, and this is post fader, so it's just sending the blend we have down here to our reverbs. So let's take a look at the first one, and that is my snare plate. So let's just pop that in and out so you can hear what it's doing. So adding a nice kind of lushness and a little bit of space around it. Let's crank that up a little bit so you can hear what it's doing better. So as the name implies, I am using a plate for this. In this case, I'm using McDSP's Revolver, which is a convolution reverb, similar to Altiverb or Waves IR1, I think it might be called. I'm not sure. And there's a handful of other ones out there. But basically, a convolution reverb samples a particular piece of gear or a particular room. And in this case, the impulse response I'm using is from a Bricasti hardware reverb unit. And the particular setting is snare plate A. Now, it's worth noting that these Bricasti samples do not come with Revolver, so don't go out and buy this reverb specifically because you saw in this video that it has Bricasti sounds in it, because when you buy it, it doesn't. It's got a lot of good sounds, but not that one. But the good news is, if you own a convolution reverb, like I said, like Altiverb or the Waves one, again, I think it might be called Waves IR1 or IRL, I don't remember. Or a handful of other ones. Heck, I think even Logic might come with a convolution reverb built in, but I'm not positive on that either. These IRs from the Bricasti are available online for totally free. I'll put a link in the description down below so you can download those if you want and add those into your reverb. But there are a lot of other options for this reverb. For instance, Liquid Sonics makes the plugin Seventh Heaven Reverb, which is based on the Bricasti and would have this setting in it. And I think the Slate Reverb has Bricasti settings in it as well, so that would also have the snare plate A. But as we'll see in a second, you can get something very similar with something that's totally unrelated to the Bricasti. The idea of my snare plate reverb is just to add some really nice space and ambience to the snare. It's a little bit longer than the next one we're going to talk about. The reverb time on this, the RT60 time, looks like it's, I don't know, maybe a second and a half or something. So it's definitely not super long, and that's because I really don't want that like hanging out for a while because, you know, the snare is hitting every second or so. So if you've got this really big, long 3-4 second reverb, it's just going to be hanging out way too long and it'll really be muddying things up and clouding up your drum mix. So by keeping it pretty short, it just gets out of the way. And then I also have the pre-delay set to 20 milliseconds, and the pre-delay is literally just a delay before the reverb. So in this case, the snare will hit, and then 20 milliseconds later, the reverb will start. And the idea of the pre-delay here is just to put a little bit of space in between the initial sound and the reverb. It'll kind of separate them a little bit. I mean, 20 milliseconds is really short. You're not going to like really genuinely hear that as a delay, but it just helps the snare drum to sit a little bit more forward. Just that tiny bit of separation between the two helps you get that nice big ambient sound that we want without the snare drum sounding far away or washy. And then after my reverb, I just have an EQ and I'm rolling off everything below about 200 hertz. And this is just to clean up the low end a little bit. So the fundamental of our snare drum is going to be somewhere around 200 hertz. So anything below that, we totally don't need. That's just going to be muddying up our mix. And in this case, you can see I've got a fairly gentle slope here. So I'm actually cutting a good bit around the 200 hertz fundamental. And that's just because there was a lot of the fundamental coming through the reverb. but we're already getting all of that from our close mics. So by ducking that down a little bit in the reverb and letting the reverb be more focused on the high end, it just gives us kind of a cleaner, nicer sound. Let's check that out. So you can hear how much of that fundamental we're cutting out, but let me drop that back down to where we had it in the mix and check it out one more time. So once we have the volume lower, you can really hear how much cleaner the snare sounds with this EQ in. When the volume was higher, it kind of sounded better without the EQ because you were getting all that nice low end. But once we had it properly balanced, you were hearing all that low end in the close mics. But anyway, let's listen to that in the full drum mix. So I don't have a ton of that mixed in, just a little bit. And that's because I still want this to sound like a nice, clean, modern drum set. Like I want that nice space and ambience that the reverb is giving us, but I don't want the reverb to sound obvious. I don't want people to specifically hear the reverb. I want them to hear the drums and the drums to sound awesome and ambient and nice, but I don't want it to just be like this big washy mess. So just putting that little bit in gives a really nice space around our snare drum. And real quick, just to show you that there are a ton of options for this, that you don't need to go buy a convolution reverb if you don't already have one, or one of those other Bricasti plugins that I mentioned. I'll show you that you can get a really similar sound with, in this case, I'm using Valhalla plate, but you could get something that works really well with almost any plate plugin. You could use other sounds too, but I've just found that plates work really, really well on snare drums. But anyway, in this case, I'm using Valhalla plate, and I'm a big fan of this plugin. But just going over the settings real quick, we have a decay time of 1.7 seconds. Once again, about a 20 millisecond pre-delay. Then for the mode, I'm set to brass. There are just a ton of different modes in this plugin to get a lot of different sounds. And I just like the attack of this brass setting. It sounded very similar to what I'm used to hearing in that Bricasti setting that I usually use. And then I'm just taming the high end a little bit, bringing everything above 3.6K down by about 5 decibels. So let's check that out. So yeah, that's sounding really good too. And in this case, I think I actually might like that a little bit better than the Bricasti setting that I actually used in this song. But both totally work. So moving on to our second snare reverb, and that's my Snare Smash reverb. And the name Snare Smash really doesn't make any sense anymore. I used to compress the heck out of this reverb, and that's where the name Snare Smash came from. But I don't do that anymore, but the name has stuck around. But anyway, let's take a listen to it. So once again, pretty subtle, but let's crank it up a little bit so you can really hear what's going on. And let's see what we're doing to get that sound. So I'm once again using Revolver, and once again, it's with a setting that did not come with this reverb. And in this case, the actual setting I'm using is the Nonlin 2 from the AMS RMX16 reverb. There are a few other options to get this exact sound. I know UAD has a plugin based on the RMX16. And again, I think the Slate Reverb plugin has this setting in it. But much like with our snare plate, I'll show you in a minute that you don't need this exact sound, that there are a bunch of reverbs that can get something very, very similar. So you don't necessarily have to worry about going out and buying something to get this sound. So with our first reverb, we were really looking for that sort of reverb sound, you know, that nice ambient space around the snare. But with this one, I really think of this as an extension of the snare drum itself. So you can hear it's super short and kind of explosive sounding, and it kind of helps to just like lengthen the sound of the snare drum. Let's duck this back down to where we had it, and I'll pop it in and out again. And just try to listen for that lengthening of the snare, as well as a little bit of added width that this is going to give. So yeah, just a little bit wider, a little bit longer, and a little bit more explosive with that end. Let me just pump the volume up a little bit again, and we'll check that out one more time. Also worth noting here, you can see I have my pre-delay set to -70, which first off is pretty weird because most reverbs don't have negative pre-delay. But ultimately, that's just because this particular impulse response that I have had a little bit of a gap up front for whatever reason. So by using the negative pre-delay here, it's just getting rid of the gap. In most cases, with pretty much any other reverb plugin for this, I would just have the pre-delay at 0. Because with this being part of the snare sound, like I was saying before, I don't want that little gap in there like I did with the plate. I want this hitting right with the snare drum to really make it part of the sound. Let's see what we're doing to process this reverb. So we've got a little bit of EQ going on. First up is a similar high-pass filter around 200 Hertz. In this case, we're cutting out a little bit less of the fundamental, but still a little bit. Let's check that out. So once again, just cleaning up the low end a little bit, letting the actual snare mics take care of the low end. And then we just have a little dip here at about 3.5K, cutting out 2 decibels or so. So it was just sounding a little bit harsh and kind of ratty sounding. So we're just dipping that down a little bit to control that. And that brings up a good point. Don't be afraid to EQ or process your reverbs. Not just your snare reverbs, but any of your reverbs or effects or delays or whatever. I think a lot of the time people just throw a reverb up and that's that. But in certain cases, you might really need to shape it to make it work with the track. But moving on from there, we've got one more plugin and I'm using the Waves S1 Imager. So this is a stereo widening tool and it looks like we're cranking the width up about 47% just to make this super, super wide and exaggerated. Let's check that out. So yeah, just pushing it out to the sides a little bit. So like I said, the 2 main things we were looking for in this reverb were the extra length and explosiveness and a little bit of extra width. So this is just helping us to get that extra width, as well as clear up a little bit of room in the center for the actual snare drum. Without this on, the reverb is kind of stepping on top of the actual snare mics, which are obviously panned right up the center. But with this in, it opens up a little bit of space in the center of our reverb for our snare mics to go through, and then just pushes the reverb out to the sides where we really want it. And once again, let me show you that you can get this sound with tons of different reverbs. In this case, I'm using Deverb, which is the stock reverb inside Pro Tools. And in this case, I'm using the non-lin setting. And if you're not familiar with nonlinear reverbs, they sound kind of similar to a gated reverb. So like with a traditional reverb, like a hall, church, plate, etc. So your reverb starts off nice and high and then like gently slopes off. But with a non-linear reverb, or like I said, you can get a very similar sound with a gated reverb. It's a lot of reverb and then it drops off very, very quickly. And that's what gives us that explosive sound that we're getting on our snare drum. Because there's just a whole bunch of reverb and then it's gone very quickly. So like I said, if you don't have a non-lin setting on your reverb, you could also try some gated settings or make your own gated reverb. But anyway, I have the decay time set to 180 milliseconds, so super, super short. Depending on your reverb, it could be quite a bit longer to get a similar sound. On certain plugins, it might be as high as maybe a second, but anything much higher than that will probably start to sound too much like just a regular old reverb and not like this big explosion of sound. Let's turn both of these up a little bit, and then we're going to flip back and forth between our Deverb setting and our setting in Revolver, just to show you how close you can get with a totally free plugin. So that Deverb setting sounds really good. They're not identical, but they are totally close enough that you could absolutely use either in the mix. So let me go back to Revolver and turn the faders back down to where we had it. And I'm going to put it into the full drum mix again and pop this reverb in and out. So yeah, especially with the turned up there, you can really hear that extra explosiveness, that extra length, and that extra width that it's adding to our snare. And real quick, let's take one more listen with and without both of our reverbs together. So first we'll start without and then we'll pop them in. So even with how low they are in this mix, they're still adding a lot to the sound. When they're muted, it just sounds kind of flat and a little bit unexciting. And once you pop them in, it sounds much, much more polished, much more exciting, much bigger. And real quick, I want to show you one last reverb-like thing that I often do in mixes. I didn't do it in this particular mix, but I still thought I'd show you because I think it's pretty cool. But a lot of the time, if I'm mixing something and the room mic doesn't have enough snare in it, so I'm not naturally getting enough roomy snare sound just in the mics, I will use a room-only snare drum sample. For this mix, I didn't have to do this because we captured a really, really good room sound with a lot of snare drum in it. But there are a lot of times where there just isn't enough snare in the room mic, or the room mic might not sound very good to begin with, or there might not be a room mic at all. But let's turn this up and take a look. So in this particular case, I'm using the Disaster Snare Room and the Smack Snare Room. And both of these are available on my website, bettermixes.com, as well as a ton of other drum samples. So if you like the sound of these or just feel like trying out some new drum samples, head on over there to check them out. Let's just take a listen to just these samples. So here's just the Disaster Room. And this is just the Smack Room. And like I said, these can be really nice to add in because it can act as a super, super realistic reverb essentially, because it's the actual captured reverb of a snare in my live room. But just to show you how much these can add, let's solo up our snare again, and then we'll sneak these room samples in. So that's a great way to add some ambient and some extra excitement to your drum sound, especially if you don't have a great sounding room mic to begin with. But anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. Also, head on over to bettermixes.com to grab a free copy of my Ultimate EQ cheat sheet. And while you're there, like I said, if you like these drum samples, I've got a ton of them available. So be sure to check those out.